welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate it. As always, once again, you know what I always say, we have a great show for you on this Monday evening. We'll be talking about J.D. Vance saying he regrets tweeting negative things about the leader of the Republican Party. You know he still is Donald Trump, and he is now being forced to recant some of his previous statements about Donald Trump, and doing so willingly to prove his allegiance to the dear leader. Also, at 245, America is old enough to be honest about its founding. That's a pretty tall and pretty generous assumption there from Jon Schwarz, but we'll talk about his great new piece in The Intercept. And to lead our show today, I want to start with a little bit of more of a conversation, and a conversation started by Gabriel Winnan and Jacobin about what is the future of the socialist left, how will they progress down the road in the months, years, decades to come, and why the future may be looking a little bit brighter than you may think at this time. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here today. Welcome to a good July 5th show. Hopefully everybody had a enjoyable holiday weekend with some family. I would say probably the first real holiday where COVID has not been a big thing for much of the country. It really does feel like COVID here in the United States has ended in terms of effect. Some restrictions. I actually don't know how many restrictions are still in place. I don't think it's very many across the country. Pretty much going back to full capacity nationwide. We're seeing vaccination rates, while they are not quite exactly where Joe Biden wanted them to be, they are in a pretty good position nonetheless. So that is good to see. The biggest thing is now coming down to that last 25%, or whatever it is, of the country that is still really skeptical of the vaccine, kind of getting them to get it and inoculating them from the Delta variant. That is still probably the biggest threat out there right now as we at this moment. But we are going to today get into a piece in Jacobin magazine talking a little bit about what is to come today in the socialist movement. So, writing, this is Gabriel Winnan writing, how should we think of Indy Walton's victory in Buffalo's Democratic mayoral primary? Capturing a significant executive office, while not unprecedented in the history of American socialism, has until now mainly eluded the resurgent movement. Over the past several decades, the Democratic Socialists of America won mayoral offices in college towns like Ithaca and Berkeley, or acted as conventional left liberal politicians with a mainly sentimental link to the radical left, like David Dinkins in New York and Ron Dellums in Oakland. These figures largely represent the electoral afterlife of the New Left. Their campaigns followed the New Left's repression and disintegration in the 70s and 80s and mounted to accommodation to the impossibility of radical change. To point this out is not to criticize them necessarily. Defeat brings on difficult choices and constraints on what is possible on the local level. Nonetheless, Walton is different. And I think the biggest thing about her is she's coming out there, she's coming out aggressively. It's more than a sentimental link to kind of a socialist and democratic socialist politics. She's saying it out there, and she's saying it loud and proud. So the thing, she marks also, she's a great marking for a increasingly higher and higher water point on a movement that I think is on the ascendancy, not the descendancy. So over the last half decade of its emergence, the new socialist electoral politics has faced a generally existential challenge about its social basis. It has been a politics of mainly white and this is actually very interesting because this is what I want to get into, talking about the demographics here, the coalition building that's going to define a lot of these electoral and non-electoral movements in future years. So it has been a politics mainly of white and mainly middle-class activists, a reality that is ultimately incompatible with socialist analysis and vision. Insurgent candidates on the left have succeeded where this group is numerous enough as an electorate, as a volunteer base, or both. It is important not to obfuscate the issue with semantics about how members of the middle class, unable to live off their property and forced to sell their labor, are really workers. Such an axiom may obtain in theory, and certainly it embodies an important larger political aspiration, but we cannot abstract away the concrete problem that college-educated professionals are separated socially and politically from the working class mass base that socialist advance requires. nor is it for example, pretty much the way you should be thinking this kind of like broader terms, but it's talking about, can we win over the voters that, for example, Eric Adams and Joe Biden won? Those are the people that we need to win over to build long-term like success for socialism electorally. The possibility of socialist realignment begins in the cities. There we find concentration of downright mobile or indebted professionals who have made up most of the significant ideological cadre for the socialist politics, but have struggled to establish a sufficiently broad base. Brooklyn's Emily Gallagher, the socialist New York State Assembly member for Williamsburg and Greenpoint, provides a useful example. Formerly an educator in museums and an industry that has seen significant labor activity in the past few years, Gallagher now represents the neighborhood that one of the neighborhoods that symbolizes gentrification more distinctly than any others in the country. So ripe was her district for political turnover that she was able to oust an incumbent without institutional support from either DSA or the Working Families Party. She was just able to come in there, make her case, and get the job done. So the radicalization of lower layers of the professional middle class, however, also allows us to imagine a political continuum into the upper fraction of the working class. These groups are still different from each other, but less than ever before, particularly as first-generation college students burdened with debt and faced with limited career prospects grow in numbers. And that's going to be, I think, a big trend that we see. A lot of people who have done the right thing, quote-unquote, and taken that kind of professional managerial class route are now finding that there is not nearly as many opportunities. There's not nearly as many doors open to them as they so thought, and that leads to a little bit of good old-fashioned disillusionment. Figures like AOC, Tiffany Caban, and Jabari Bridgeport embody this area of overlap, at least in their constituencies and various things like that. So, often more stably employed, but residually a notch lower in the class system, are the organized professional workers, particularly concentrated in the social service industries such as teachers and nurses, who constitute much of the durable. And by the way, AOC, Tiffany Caban, and Jabari Bridgeport are also like part of this group socially, the aforementioned group. But back to now these teachers and nurses, kind of organized professional service workers that have had this background in labor activity for quite a while. They know what it takes, and they've had very, I think, close firsthand experiences with the system. For example, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Farah Soufran Forrest also was a nurse. She's a DSA member in New York. Rosanna Rodriguez-Sanchez in Chicago is a teacher. India Walton was a nurse. She is a nurse. Formerly was a nurse, but she was still, you know what I mean. They exemplify this phenomenon in electoral politics. Chicago Teachers Union Secretary Stacey Davis Gates, and before her, Karen Lewis, and United Teachers Los Angeles, Cecilia Mayer Cruz, and Arlene Inouye do so in the labor movement. In terms of, formally organizing, people with a deep background in organized kind of service work. Beneath this layer is a lower, both more militant and more diffuse, low-wage, less regularly employed, and more heavily policed and punished fraction of the proletariat that form the riotous core of the 2020 street uprising. While it's less present in formal politics or trade unions and lacks visible spokespeople, figures like Cori Bush, Buffalo's India Walton, and Chicago's Jeanette Taylor maintain real links to this social movement through the movement for Black Lives. It is also clear that there are frictions occurring across the fuzzy boundaries between the layers, while they're increasingly burdened with housing costs. The neighborhoods where they rent are typically not the same, and if they do overlap, one group encounters the other as the face of gentrification, even if newcomers' presence is a result of much larger forces. Older members of the more secure working class may own homes whose value may or may not be rising depending on urban geography, while younger professionals are frequently locked out of home ownership, and though in some cases poised to inherit housing wealth from aging parents. So, that is kind of not the case with everybody, but again, having that home, having that access to the home is such a key point of generational wealth, and that's where we're going to get more into the race aspect of, Black people have been it's been harder for them to get homes, and now, and especially in a political climate, economic climate, and housing climate like this, it is very, very easy to see where that could be a pretty big problem for them coming down the road. The jobs they work are unalike. A precarious graphic designer does not struggle with the same economic problems as a teacher, a nursing assistant, or custodial worker, much less an unemployed person. But they're all kind of very, I think, susceptible to similar politics. The kind of debt they incur are quite different. Student and credit card debt as opposed to medical, court, auto, payday, and for the more secure strata, mortgage debt. As we have been reminded repeatedly, The more stably employed and home-owning sections of the working class are presently much warier about defunding the police than either socialist activists or the aforementioned kind of riotous core of the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising movement. So yeah, that's where you see some of the fractions in this movement. We see people like Eric Adams and Joe Biden and Jim Clyburn able to come in and pick up a lot of these voters that have these economic interests that align with, the precarious graphic designer who's all about defund the police all day, or people who were in the streets protesting. They have a lot of the kind of same economic and material interests, and if you probably get down to it, political beliefs, but they just don't see it the same way because of these kind of wedge issues like defund the police and especially how that's been portrayed. We can compare experiences across these boundaries and identify commonalities with them, but we cannot collapse them. Organizing is the form of activity in which comparison makes up the content. As Gallagher puts it on our website, quote, "I've been a renter, a roommate, a cyclist, a commuter. I've been unemployed, underemployed, and have known too many months where I scrambled to make the rent. I've worked in retail, the gig economy, public education, and the nonprofit sector. I'm a survivor of sexual harassment and violence. I have friends who have experienced police brutality and friends who have faced their rapists in court and watched them walk free. I've lost loved ones to traffic violations and the opioid crisis. These experiences don't make me unique." While these, that's her quote there, and in the article they write, while these differences originate in the working class's economic stratification, they're often mapped out and understood through racial divisions. The professional group is largely, although not only white, does not mingle enough with the broader metropolitan working class, which is much less white, to foster the propagation of socialist ideals through ideological common sense and cultural atmosphere. The main way it is kind of happened for these professionals. If Gallagher's district were less white, she would have been far less likely to win initially, and the same is probably true for figures like Brisbort, Caban, and even Ocasio-Cortez. While this does mean quite uncomfortably is that African Americans, who most polling indicates are more favorably disposed to socialism in general, and specific left-wing policies in particular more than any other racial group, still remain largely separated from the official socialist movement. This is the political paradox that socialists must resolve, neither accepting the substitution of professionals as a political base nor abandoning socialism because it has not yet won the working class support it requires, nor becoming resigned to the inevitability of a largely white socialist movement. It doesn't have to be that way. We can still go against and kind of getting these voters who have, as I said before, similar economic policies, similar economic viewpoints, and just have not felt comfortable at all with a lot of what we see in terms of things like defund the police. I think that has been probably where defund the police had electoral impact. I think that was probably the biggest area. At the same time, even the New York Times warns of an emerging disconnect between progressive activists and rank-and-file Black and Latino voters. It is not clear the problem is getting worse. Take New York City itself. An examination of voting patterns in Astoria houses, a public housing project in Queens, Matthew Thomas points out the power of the Democratic establishment appears to be waning. For years, progressive challengers have performed worse in the complex than they have through the rest of the borough, the city, or the state. Cynthia Nixon won 23% of the vote there in 2018, but 34% statewide. Nixon's running mate, Jumaane Williams, a progressive Black New Yorker who already enjoyed some local popularity, managed 48% of the vote in Astoria housing projects against Kathy Hochul, almost identical to a statewide performance. This is particularly challenging. Like, if you're talking about a socialist, kind of, not socialist, but kind of left-wing, more progressive Black candidate, where they should really be able to clean up is a place like Astoria houses, where you got kind of a lot of minority voters and also a lot of voters who are definitely in the working class. And that is just not happening, at least as of now. In 2019, the Queens primary for District Attorney Tiffany Caban, who fought the party favorite to a virtual tie borough-wide, lost the complex by only 4%. In her city council race this year, Caban won Astoria houses easily. Even a centrist candidate, Eric Adams, did the same in the mayoral race. This presents a paradox, but also evidence the possibility is resolving it leftward. So that's going to be the most important thing. This paradox of the certain type of Astoria houses voters. Why are they not like flocking to the progressive movement in the ways that you would expect policy wise? If you're looking at who they're targeting, the progressive movement is targeting these people, but they're just not picking up the phone. There's a lot of people in the progressive movement at this time are inspired by. And I think this is again where you can get into dangerous territory. And I think this was a lot more true in 2018 than it is in 2021. The fact is, are you a lot of people in the movement, a lot of quote unquote AOC voters are supporting AOC because they think some good will happen to someone elsewhere, not people who are actually on the receiving end of what these policies should be. They have just not bought onto them yet for various reasons, like skepticism, government, kind of ineffective campaigning, whatever the case may be. And a lot of those people happen to be minorities, so that's another angle to take into account here. So, nation-wise, this same possibility has revealed itself in glimpses during the presidential primary, even as he performed worse in places like West Virginia and Michigan than 2020, then in 2016, these kind of white working class places. Bernie Sanders cleaned up with historically demobilized voters in California and union members in Nevada. The black political elite's declining ability to deliver black votes to establishment candidates contested congressional electoral victories, contesting congressional elections presents a key marker of left advance. So these kind of races are going to be very, very crucial. Can the establishment rely on undying black support like it could in South Carolina, and it couldn't in places like Rashid Tlaib's district, Michigan, I believe 13th, where they had a pretty, and it's going to be an interesting test with Nina Turner, too, and Jim Clyburn coming up. Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush in their 2020 primary victories, also suggesting that this historically significant source of conservative power with the Democratic Party is fading in the face of a direct challenge. And again, this is the party's establishment's obvious fear. In Nina Turner's victory this summer, that's what they're really kind of concerned about, as I mentioned. So AOC's re-election contains positive information as well. If detractors were right and her initial victory was simply an aberration, hyperactive Astoria gentrifiers taking a complacent incumbent by surprise, then she ought to have been vulnerable in 2020 to a well-funded opponent who could pull the district back to its supposed political center of gravity. But Ocasio-Cortez's coalition brought in, and Michelle Caruso-Guerrero's $3 million campaign only ended up garnering 20% of the vote. Perhaps even more heartening was Larry Krasner. Huge victory early on for the left. A super progressive prosecutor that really pissed a lot of people off in Philadelphia. A DA. He won the city's white liberals and black working and middle classes, even as panic about crime and social disorder returned as the preferred weapon against the left. This was in the heat of the backlash over the Fund the Police movement. People were expecting Krasner to get crushed, and he ended up crushing with an even broader coalition than before. That brings us back to Buffalo. Walton, a nurse by training, became politically active as an adult as part of Buffalo's enormous workforce in educational services and healthcare and social assistance. In 2019, 33% of the employed people in Buffalo fell into the quote-unquote eds and meds category, more than triple the size of the next group. Buffalo, a former steel town in this regard, is a little different from a place like Rochester, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, or even New York, as the Bronx has a proportionally larger healthcare workforce than any other populous county in the country. Across the former industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest, deindustrialization has produced massive social service sectors with workforces disproportionately composed of women of color. The health workforce's expansion is an index of disinvestment and social inequality has abandoned populations become older, poorer, and sicker, and are dumped onto the healthcare system, which, as a nexus of public fund and private profit, grows to absorb the displaced surplus and hires labor from post-industrial ruins. So pretty much what that's saying is the healthcare system is bad. Yeah. Anyway, so Walton embodies the political possibilities that arise from this economic transformation as care workers become responsible for keeping the population alive and holding society together through the agony of economic abandonment. They have come to personify our mutual interdependency. As Walton put it, describing how she made it as a young and poor single mother, she said, quote, "We're never alone. We're not built to be islands." And perhaps, especially in these cities all across the country, where we're seeing an exploding care sector brought on by industrialization, and turn in this social care sector, increased labor activity, that could be a key place for the explosion of labor activism and good candidates that we could see down the road. All right, we are going to have to take a quick minute-long break, and we'll be back to talk about J.D. Vance selling his soul. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to the Spencer Walsh Radio Network. I want to tell you a little bit about our lineup for this summer. We start off with Newsflash, all new, of course, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can't miss it. It's our flagship show to get caught up on everything happening in the world around you. But stick around for some history and some entertainment. Learn about all the things you never learned in history class every Thursday with Hidden History. And get ready for a fun night out or turn your living room into the club with uncultured live mixes every Saturday all summer long. The Spencer Walsh Radio Network is your home for summer sounds coming all season long. Every podcast is available everywhere, so you have no excuse not to listen. All right, let's get to it. Today, we are seeing a very interesting political dynamic play out in the Ohio Republican primary for Senate. I believe Tim Ryan is on the Democratic side, just kind of cosplaying as a labor guy for as long as he possibly can. We'll see how far that gets him. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see that. We'll talk about the Democratic side in a moment, but this is in Politico. J.D. Vance, the best-selling author and Republican Senate hopeful, said on Monday that he regretted his since-deleted Twitter post and criticized Donald Trump amid accusations of flip-flopping as he vies for a seat in Ohio. So this is, again, no surprise here. The biggest kind of Republican Party loyalty test, the qualifying box you have to check as a Republican Party candidate in this day and age is your position on Trump. Did you support him undyingly for a long, long period of time? And I got news for you. A lot of these big Republican politicians, they did not, because most of them were literally running against him at some point or another in the primary. Of course, Vance is the author of the memoir Hillbilly Elegy. He launched his campaign last week and has come under fire for deleting tweets from 2016 that were unearthed by CNN's Andrew Kaczynski, including one where he said he was voting for Evan McMullin and another calling Trump reprehensible because of his views towards immigrants and Muslims, etc. So, yeah, so pretty much J.D. Vance, is a classic grifter, kind of private equity, Peter Thiel associated guy. Peter Thiel burning money on this campaign. Just to give you, of course, a little bit of background on J.D. Vance, he is someone who, quote-unquote, grew up in the holler in Appalachia and had a pretty tough upbringing. But through it all, and this is pretty much the plot of Hillbilly Elegy, as I understand it. I think I read about like half of it like 4 or 5 years ago. But as I understand, the plot of Hillbilly Elegy from kind of watching the movie, and I know you can't get everything from the movie, is that he, throughout his tough upbringing in Appalachia, which some people have a little bit of problems with how that's depicted, he was focused on getting into Yale Law School pretty much at all costs. He got into Yale Law School, pretty much became a Republican from that, but really ran as an ever-Trump Republican. I think if you come down to it, put a gun to the head, what are your true political beliefs? What are your opinions about Trump? I think he was much, much more accurate in 2016 when he was saying all these critical things, because that's who he is at heart. He's a business-style, never-Trump Republican who doesn't really care too much about social issues, but just wants to, make $6 billion off Roth IRA, like his big best friend Peter Thiel. That is who he wants to manipulate the economic system to his will. And whatever he has to say about immigrants or some certain election that may have taken place and may have had a certain result or possibly another result, that is fine by him. This guy, look at him. He screams quarter zip Patagonia fleece vest and, Yale Law School, all that stuff. And Evan McMullin voter through and through. I completely believe it. A recent Daily Beast column ran with the headline, Hypocrite Elegy. J.D. Vance is an avatar of GOP corruption and Democratic representative at this time, Tim Ryan, who's again vying for the Ohio Senate seat. J.D. Vance won, and I have exactly one thing in common. Neither of us voted for Donald Trump. Now as he runs for office, Vance has shifted towards a pro-Trump position, recently visiting the former president in Florida in hopes of earning his endorsement. He told Fox News on Monday that he hoped people wouldn't judge him for his past remarks, which he walked back. I don't know if that's the best approach, the biggest thing about in the Republican Party is who can emulate Trump the best. So I think maybe would have been smarter was just be like, you know what, screw, I didn't make those remarks. Those were fake tweets. Someone hacked my Twitter account. Like, get off my back. Just completely saying things that are just to like troll people almost in a way. Just saying things that are on their face patently ridiculous. But just saying it to get a rise out of people and knowing that people will react to the situation. So instead of just being like, please don't judge me, I was stupid back then, I was cucked, I'm sorry, like that kind of thing. I like a lot of people, I criticized Trump back in 2016, Vance said, and I asked folks not to judge me based on what I said in 2016 because I've been very open that he did say those critical things. I regret them, and I regret being wrong about the guy. I think he was a good president. I think he made a lot of good decisions for people, and I think he took a lot of flack. Vance added that he himself has been criticized for standing up for the former president's voters and agenda, saying, I think that's the most important thing, is not what you said 5 years ago, but whether you're willing to stand up and take the heat and take the hits for actually defending the interests of the American people. So, of course, what he's trying to do here is shift away from the Evan McMullen-style, bloodthirsty capitalist type of guy to being much more of a, Tucker Carlson-style populist who really, truly understands the working class of Appalachia in Ohio, and all over the place, and possibly nationally. Who knows what ambitions that guy has. He's a Peter Thiel associate. He probably wants to conquer the whole world. The GOP candidate went on to say that he was sure primary challengers would use his deleted tweets against him, adding that he thought they had the baggage of their own related to Trump and other issues. As the Ohio Senate primary is currently overflowing with candidates ahead of Senator Rob Portman's retirement in 2022, making Trump's endorsement all the more enticing for those in the race. And I have a feeling that will be potentially quite decisive. All right, let's move on to our second piece in 2 shows by the legend, Jon Schwarz. He writes, happy birthday today, America. Today, July 4th, 2021, we turn 245 years old. You might think we'd have trouble blowing out all those candles on the cake, but unfortunately, we can use the downdraft from the Sikorsky S-97 Raider, a new prototype helicopter with 2 rotors that spin in the opposite directions. Pretty sick. We're spending enough money for 100,000 people's healthcare to build one of them. And now that we're 245, it seems that as though we should be old enough to take an honest look at the various dumb and awful things about our birth and stop believing preposterous myths. While the American Revolution officially began at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in April of 1775, for some time afterward, complete separation from Great Britain was only supported by a fervent minority. However, nothing works as well as killing and being killed to make everyone believe the other side are irredeemable monsters. By June 1776, public sentiment favored a total break. The Declaration of Independence was drafted by Thomas Jefferson with edits of several others, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. It is filled with the kind of unpredictable capitalization that was common of kind of the idea before English was standardized. It includes King George III of attempting to impose both absolute despotism and absolute tyranny on the 13 colonies, which, say what you will about that. It's another kind of era of, English was kind of a pre-standardization of English moment there, if you ask me. But also, we very touchingly did have a 45th president who wrote the same way, so I guess some things never change. With the benefit of hindsight, many of the complaints make this seem like the kind of excitable language you employ to justify a decision you've already made. For instance, King George called together legislative bodies at places unusual for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance. Bad, maybe, but not the worst crime in human history. This style of wild rhetoric and exaggeration survives today among Americans who proclaim the phase out of incandescent light bulbs is exactly like what Hitler did. The most interesting parts of the Declaration are 2 complaints. One that made it into the final version, one that did not. The one that did make it into the final entry on the list was the indictments of King George. He has excited domestic insurrections against us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an indistinguished kind of destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This is the kind of thing that makes you wonder whether Josh Hawley, who just condemned the idea that the United States was founded in racism, has literally ever read the Declaration of Independence, because that part is in there. He also may never have heard of George Washington, who has once told a friend that indigenous people in America and wolves were both beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. At least he's got that part right. Then there is a clause about slavery in Jefferson's original rough draft of the Declaration. King George said Jefferson had waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life, liberty, and the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. What? Wow, seems like some kind of gaslighting there, to use a modern term, or to incur miserable death in the transformation hither. I don't know. I honestly don't know if they're talking about like black slaves or, the Russia, like the passage that, their ancestors took over there. This seems like conclusive evidence that white Americans were capable at the time of grasping. Yeah, they were capable of grasping at the time that, slavery was evil, but then still continued it for like at least, 100, not 100, more like 90 years, from 1776. Thus, judging those who engaged in it is not presentism, in which we impose today's moral standards on the past. Of course, Jefferson himself owned at least 600 slaves during his life, presumably, and that's an important point there. I do want to go back on it. Like, they literally wrote in the Declaration of Independence that King George was, supporting slavery. This is not a bad look. Like, they were like, George, we're going to have to call you out here. You're supporting the transportation of slavery. So I don't want to hear it. Like, that was what they were trying to do, trying to flip that on King George, when, of course, they were all benefiting from slavery magnificently. They knew it was bad, and they were also happy to use it for their own political ends, but also, or call it out for their own political ends, but then go on using it, again, as I said, for another 90 years. Jefferson himself owned literally the writer of the Declaration of Independence owned at least 600 slaves during his life. Presumably, he understood that they were not working at his plantation by choice, just because they wanted him to have more free time philosophizing, I guess however you'd say that. Jefferson squared the circle by also condemning King George for now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty which had been deprived of them by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them. So this is very good here. First, King George forced people like Jefferson to enslave human beings. This is the great logic of our founding fathers here, which they never would have done otherwise, of course. Thomas Jefferson would never have enslaved people otherwise. And now King George was making these enslaved humans believe it was terrible to be enslaved, something they would have never figured out on their own. This was tyranny in its purest form. Later, in 1821, Jefferson wrote that the slavery clause had been removed by the full Continental Congress in compliance with South Carolina and Georgia. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people had very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. A little bit more honesty. GOP-controlled state governments that are today cracking down on the teaching of history might want to bar Jefferson's first point, but emphasize his second, to own the libs. New York City, the capital of liberalism, had once kind of been one of America's largest slave markets on Wall Street for much of the 18th century, and continues to have many streets named after prominent families of that era that enriched themselves in the slave trade. None of this means, again, that U.S. history and the founding is uniquely dreadful. The foundings of other countries were similarly bloody and hypocritical, but it does mean that when we're tempted to bloviate about our own, keyword here, unique goodness, that we should probably cool it just a little bit. And obviously, there are some good parts of the Declaration of Independence, one so universally inspiring that Ho Chi Minh copied them directly when he wrote a proclamation of independence for Vietnam in 1945. America was so touched by this that a few years later, we considered giving France a few nuclear weapons to drop on Vietnam. The Declaration today resides in the National Archives in Washington. It's barely legible, but still worth a visit as an opportunity to be honest with ourselves about what our history is truly about. It wasn't created by a perfect race of angels, but by people who are just as sweaty, confused, and occasionally drunk as we all are. Just like us, they grievous faults and intermittent noble aspirations. And if they could change the world, and they definitely did, we can too. A pretty good 4th of July mention there from Jon Schwarz, and exactly how I want to end today's show. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Newsflash.